My name is Hortense Barlow, and last night my own daughter looked me in the eye and said, "You'll eat after everyone else." The words sliced through me harder than any wound I ever saw in my years as an Army nurse. She didn't whisper it in private. She announced it at the dinner table, in front of her husband, her children, and a room full of relatives. For a moment, the air froze, and I realized I wasn't her mother anymore. I was her target. So I stood up, lifted the roast I had brought to share, and walked out without another word. That's the night I stopped being silent. Amanda's invitation had landed in my mailbox a week earlier, written in her crisp handwriting as if it were some formal event. Dinner at our place, Mom, Saturday night, 7 p.m. It had been years since she'd asked me to share a meal at her home, and I let myself believe it meant something, that perhaps, finally, the sharp edges between us might soften. I spent the afternoon pressing my one good dress, polishing the modest shoes I'd worn to church for years, and selecting the old bottle of red wine I had been saving for a moment of reconciliation. When I arrived, her house shone like a magazine spread, sleek countertops, stainless steel appliances, not a hint of warmth anywhere. The air smelled of rosemary, garlic, and something else I couldn't quite place, the chill of formality. Amanda greeted me with a perfunctory hug, already glancing over her shoulder toward her guests. Her husband poured wine, her children whispered to each other at the far end of the table, and cousins I hadn't seen in years occupied the seats. The table was set with precision, china gleaming, silverware lined like soldiers on parade. At the center, steaming dishes waited to be carved and shared. For a fleeting second, I let myself imagine the kind of family dinner I had always wanted. Laughter, warmth, a sense of belonging. I pulled out my chair, setting my modest gift of wine on the sideboard, hoping someone might notice. Then Amanda's voice cut through the air, clear and sharp, just as the roast was placed at the center of the table. "Mom will eat after everyone else." She didn't whisper it, didn't soften it. She declared it, loud enough for every fork to freeze mid-air. A cousin stifled a chuckle. Someone shifted uncomfortably, and all eyes turned toward me. The heat rose up my neck, flooding my face. I could hear the echo of nights long gone, me working graveyard shifts at the base hospital, sneaking into Amanda's room at dawn to check if she was breathing, pressing my lips to her forehead before collapsing on the couch. Every sacrifice, every moment I had given her suddenly twisted into this. Public shame served like a side dish at her table. My hands trembled, but not with weakness, with clarity. I set my knife and fork down with deliberate calm, the clink loud against the silence. I stood, reached for the platter of roast, the one I had watched them season, baste, and praise, and lifted it into my arms. Amanda's eyes widened, her smirk faltered, but I didn't say a word. Without another glance, I turned, carrying the roast with me as if it were the last shred of dignity I still owned. Behind me, I could hear whispers rising, chairs scraping, someone letting out a shocked laugh. The front door shut with a thud that echoed in my chest. That was the moment it became clear. This was never meant to be a family dinner. It was a performance, and I was cast as the fool to be humiliated. But she underestimated me, because that night, I decided I wouldn't play the part anymore. The night air was cold as I drove home, but it was nothing compared to the chill inside me. Amanda's voice still rang sharp in my ears, as if she were sitting beside me, repeating that sentence over and over. I kept my eyes on the dark road, but all I could see was the little girl she used to be and the gulf that had grown between us. When her father died in that scaffold accident, Amanda was only 10. I was 35, suddenly a widow, and I had no choice but to survive. The Army hospital gave me extra shifts, and I took them all. Nights spent under fluorescent lights, stitching wounds and monitoring heartbeats, and mornings stumbling through our front door just in time to make her breakfast, braid her hair, and walk her to the bus stop before collapsing on the couch. I thought those gestures would tell her that no matter how exhausted I was, she was still my world. But whispers poisoned the air. Her father's relatives never missed a chance to cut me down. She only cares about her job. She's never really there for Amanda. The words weren't meant for my ears alone, but Amanda heard them too, again and again, until they rooted themselves in her mind. I'll never forget the morning she sat at the kitchen table, her spoon clinking against the bowl, and looked at me with more bitterness than a 12-year-old should know. I wish you were like the other moms, home more, not always gone. It split me open in a way no scalpel ever could. I told myself she was too young to understand, that one day she'd see the truth. But she never did. As the years passed, she rose in her career. Finance, sharp suits, sharper words. The higher she climbed, the more she looked at me as if I were some relic from a forgotten era. That dinner last night hadn't come out of nowhere. It was the end point of a long, unhealed wound. Sitting at that table, hearing her strip me of dignity, I realized she hadn't just been shaming me for one evening. She had been preparing that verdict against me since childhood, convinced that my sacrifices were evidence of neglect. The morning light barely softened the heaviness that sat on my chest. I was at the kitchen table, staring at the roast platter abandoned in the sink, when a knock came at the door. It was Mildred, my neighbor of 30 years, holding her basket of eggs as if it were just another ordinary visit, but her eyes told me otherwise. She set the basket down and touched my arm. "Hortense, have you heard? People are saying Amanda and her husband are in deep trouble. His construction company, debts piled high on the edge of collapse." Her words stunned me. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding. Before I could ask, she lowered her voice. "The talk is, she's aiming for your house. That dinner might have been just the beginning." I sat motionless, her words sinking in like stones. Images from the night before rushed back, Amanda's hard stare, the way she pronounced my humiliation like a public sentence. It wasn't just cruelty. It was strategy. After Mildred left, I wandered through the house, touching each piece that carried memory. The photographs of a young family smiling in front of half-finished walls, the rocking chair my husband built with his calloused hands, the scent of sawdust still faint in the wood. This wasn't just shelter. It was the last part of him still alive within these walls. Amanda didn't just want to shame me. She wanted to strip me bare of everything I had left, piece by piece. I stood in the middle of the living room, the sunlight cutting through the blinds, and felt the truth land with weight I couldn't deny. The dinner invitation had been no gesture of peace. It was the first move in a campaign to take the only inheritance I still held. Sunday morning came with a knock on my door. When I opened it, Amanda stood there holding a bouquet of red roses. Her smile stretched too tight, the kind of smile she'd never once offered me without something hidden behind it. I invited her in, though my stomach already knew trouble had arrived. We made small talk over coffee, her words syrupy sweet, her eyes darting around my modest living room as though measuring it. Then her voice dropped, and she slid a folder across the table. "Mom, sign this. It's just a guarantor form so the bank knows you're financially stable. I've taken care of everything for you." I picked it up, my pulse quickening as I read line by line. This wasn't a simple guarantor form. It was a full power of attorney, transferring every asset I owned into Amanda's control, including the very house beneath our feet. I raised my eyes to hers. They gleamed, sharp and expectant, as if my signature were nothing more than a formality. "You think I can't read?" My voice came out calm, though my chest burned. Amanda blinked, caught off guard. Then her expression hardened. "You're old, Mom. You don't understand legal terms. I just want to protect you." Protect me. The word felt poisonous. I pushed the papers back across the table. Her voice cracked with fury now. "Did you ever think about me? About how I had to raise myself because you chose the hospital over me? You were never there, not when I needed a mother." Each accusation stabbed at the old scars I carried, scars from nights spent working while she cried herself to sleep, scars I thought time might heal. She was twisting my sacrifices into weapons, using my guilt as leverage. In that moment, it was no longer about helping her through a crisis. It was about survival. Sleep didn't come that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling until I couldn't take it anymore. I climbed into the attic. Dust thick in the air, my flashlight cutting through years of cobwebs. I opened old boxes I hadn't touched in decades, searching for something, though I didn't know what. In the corner, bound with coarse rope, sat a wooden chest I hadn't seen since the day of the funeral. My hands trembled as I pried it open. Inside lay yellow documents, the edges curling, and a folded letter in my husband's handwriting. There was his life insurance policy, small but still valid, and shares from a modest construction company he once invested in. I unfolded the letter. The ink faded, but his voice alive on the page. "Hortense, if anything happens to me, keep this safe. It's for you and for Amanda. Don't let anyone take it from you." The words blurred through my tears. He'd been gone more than 30 years, but it felt like he had just spoken. I pressed the letter to my chest, my body shaking with both grief and resolve. Amanda knew nothing about this chest, this insurance, this proof that he had thought of us even in death. If she ever discovered it, she would stop at nothing to claim it. I sat back on my heels, breathing in the dust of old wood and forgotten years. For the first time, I saw my path clearly. This wasn't just a clash of personalities or a painful mother-daughter rift. It was a fight for the last remnants of dignity, memory, and the love my husband had entrusted to me. Amanda thought she was circling only my house, blind to the deeper roots buried in my attic. What she didn't know could protect me, if I had the strength to guard it. And I realized then, this battle was no longer just between mother and daughter. It was war over legacy itself. A week later, Amanda called, her tone rehearsed, almost sweet. She wanted me at her house for a family meeting. I had no illusions about what that meant, but I went anyway. When I stepped into her living room, the sight struck me like a stage play. Relatives I hadn't seen in years crowded onto the sofas, their plates of hors d'oeuvres balanced on knees, Amanda standing at the center like a judge prepared to deliver a verdict. She began with a voice dripping with sympathy. "Mother needs help," she said, scanning the room. "We all need to step in before things get worse." Then she pulled a stack of papers from a folder and waved them for all to see. "Proof," she declared, "that she's drowning in debt. The bank will soon come for her house. If we don't act now, she'll lose everything." A murmur rippled through the room. Some cousins shook their heads. Others whispered behind hands. I took the papers and felt the familiar stab of anger tighten my chest. My name scrawled across the page, the shaky loop of a signature I knew wasn't mine. Amanda raised her chin, her eyes gleaming. She isn't of sound mind anymore. She doesn't understand what she's risking. I only want to protect her from herself. I looked up at the circle of relatives, their pity-laced eyes already half convinced, when suddenly Samuel, my younger brother, rose to his feet. His voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I've seen her practicing that signature, 'Don't be fooled.' These are fake." The room erupted in gasps and overlapping voices. Heads turned, faces swung back to Amanda. For a flicker of a moment, her mask slipped. Color drained from her cheeks before she forced a brittle smile, the kind that begged for composure but reeked of panic. The performance she had orchestrated to isolate me had collapsed in front of the very audience she'd gathered. The next day, I carried those papers straight to Wilson. The attorney, who had once been my husband's friend, he studied them in silence, his brow furrowing deeper with every page. Finally, he pushed the stack back to me and shook his head. Brazen forgeries. This isn't just wrong, it's criminal. Hearing it aloud steadied something inside me. For so long, Amanda's words had carried the power to bend me with guilt. But here was the truth, carved in black and white. I wasn't the unstable one. She was the liar. The following afternoon, she arranged another family lunch, determined to reset the narrative. She played her part flawlessly at first, passing dishes, laughing lightly, touching my arm as though she cared. But when I rose and said evenly, "The attorney confirmed every document you gave me is a fraud," the laughter died. Fork stilled. The air thickened until no one moved. Amanda tried to smile. "Mother, you're imagining things again. I only ever wanted what's best for you." Her voice quivered under its own weight. She gathered her papers quickly, shoving them into her bag too quickly. A single sheet slipped out and floated to the floor. Samuel bent to pick it up before she could. The silence cracked as he held it aloft, sheet after sheet of practice signatures. My name traced over and over, alongside pressed fingerprints inked on cheap paper. The proof of her deception lay in full view. Gasps filled the room. Amanda's eyes darted from one relative to another, cornered at last. Her smile vanished, replaced by the raw snarl of a daughter who had dropped her final disguise. "You always think you're right," she hissed, her voice trembling with fury. "But you'll see. Mother, I don't give up." The performance was over. The mask she'd clung to shattered before everyone who once believed in it, and in its place stood the truth. Not a dutiful daughter, but a woman ready to wage war against her own blood. The church had always been a place of refuge for me. For more than 30 years, I had sat in those pews, sung hymns under the vaulted ceiling, and bowed my head in prayer. But on that Sunday, the sanctuary felt less like a refuge and more like a courtroom. The congregation had gathered for a community celebration, and Amanda was already there when I arrived, immaculate in a tailored dress, her hair pulled back neatly, pearls at her ears. She moved through the crowd like a politician, smiling, clasping hands, whispering greetings. To anyone who didn't know better, she looked every bit the picture of a devoted daughter. When she finally took her place near the pulpit, she raised her voice just enough for everyone to hear. "I've tried to look after my mother," she said, her eyes sweeping across the rows, "but she refuses help. She insists on carrying on in ways that only bring her more hardship. It breaks my heart to see her suffer by her own stubbornness." A few people nodded, murmuring their sympathy, and I felt the sting of shame rise in my chest again, hot and familiar. For a moment I stayed seated, hands clenched in my lap, the weight of years pressing me down. But then I remembered the folder in my bag, the one Wilson had prepared with such care. Slowly, I stood. The wooden pew creaked beneath me, and the room quieted, curious eyes turning my way. I walked to the front, my steps steady despite the tremor in my hands. When I reached the aisle, I pulled the folder free and held it close, my voice low but firm. "What my daughter says is not the truth," I began. The hush deepened. "These are the documents she has used to shame me, to convince you I am incapable of managing my own life. Every one of them, fake, forged, lies written in my name. Gasps rippled through the room. The sound of papers rustling carried as I lifted each page, showing the signatures, the stamps, the proof of manipulation. "Here," I said, my voice steady, "is the debt she invented. Here's the signature she copied. Here's the fingerprint pressed in ink that was never mine." My words echoed off the high ceiling, heavy and undeniable. Amanda laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that rang false. "Mother," she said, forcing a smile, "you're confused again. These claims are baseless. I only wanted to make sure you were safe." But the thin veneer of control was slipping. Sweat beaded at her hairline, her polished composure cracking under the weight of silence. I lowered the papers, looking at her directly. And in that stillness, something inside her broke. Her voice rose, shrill and raw. "Fine," she shouted, the sound bouncing off the stone walls. "Yes, I did it. I did everything to save my husband's company, to save us from ruin. That house, your useless old house, should have been ours. You didn't deserve to keep it." The words tore through the sanctuary like a storm. Heads turned, whispers flared, eyes widened. The mask Amanda had worn for so long crumbled in an instant, and the truth lay bare for all to see. I stood rooted in place, the folder pressed to my chest, the weight of vindication sinking in. For years she had painted me as weak, negligent, a relic to be pitied. But now, in front of the very people she sought to charm, she had condemned herself with her own tongue. The silence that followed was not the silence of disbelief, it was the silence of judgment, of recognition. One by one, faces turned away from her, no longer charmed by her pearls and polished words. Her reputation, her careful image of success and filial duty, shattered on the floor of the church. And in that moment, I no longer felt small. I no longer felt like the mother who had to explain or defend. I felt the steady, unshakable truth. I had survived war zones, loss, and loneliness. And now, I had survived her. The morning after Amanda's outburst in the church, I met Wilson at his office. His desk was already lined with files, the forged documents Amanda had flaunted as proof of my incompetence, now organized into neat stacks. He slid the papers across to me, his tone measured but resolute. "We'll file today. The evidence is overwhelming. She left us everything we need." By noon, the complaint was officially filed with the county clerk. Wilson walked me step by step through the process, the fraudulent debt documents, the repeated forgeries of my signature, the evidence of fabricated fingerprints. "It isn't just a civil matter," he explained. "It's criminal fraud, attempted theft of property, conspiracy. Amanda and her husband have backed themselves into a corner." That afternoon, the sheriff's deputies visited Amanda's home. I wasn't there, but I heard later from Mildred, who lived close by, that neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk as the officers approached. Amanda opened the door with her polished facade intact, pearls gleaming against her throat. But when she saw the badges, the papers handed to her, the whispers swelling from the street, the mask slipped. Her husband stood behind her, his face pale, his tie loosened as though the walls themselves had caved in. By evening, the news had spread beyond the neighborhood. In a town like ours, word traveled fast, and whispers moved quicker than any headline. Amanda, the ambitious professional who once prided herself on control, was now the subject of hushed conversations in the grocery aisle, pointed glances at the gas station, pitying shakes of the head in church pews. She hadn't just humiliated me anymore. She had humiliated herself. I returned home that night, the weight of exhaustion heavy but softened by a quiet clarity. The house greeted me like an old friend. Its wooden beams creaked under my steps. The photographs along the hallway seemed to breathe with life again. I settled into the rocking chair my husband had built, the one that had carried me through so many sleepless nights. For the first time in years, I felt no need to defend myself, no compulsion to relive every sacrifice. I thought of Amanda's words at the dinner table. "You'll eat after everyone else." That sentence had been meant to reduce me, to make me smaller than everyone around me. But as I sat there in the stillness of my home, I smiled, softly, not bitterly, for the first time. She had tried to cast me as powerless, but in doing so, she revealed the truth of her own desperation. What she believed was a victory, cornering me with papers and false debts, was the very rope that bound her downfall. Her lies had not only collapsed under scrutiny, they had become the proof of her guilt. The irony was sharp, almost poetic. She had thought herself clever, wielding forged documents like weapons, imagining me too blind to notice, too weak to resist. But her arrogance had turned those very weapons into evidence against her. In the end, she hadn't destroyed me, she had destroyed herself. I sat there for a long while, my fingers resting on the folded letter I had found in the attic. My husband's words echoed through me. "Don't let anyone take it from you." He had trusted me to hold the line, to guard the remnants of our life, and I had done exactly that, not through anger, not through shouting, but through truth. The house felt different that night, warmer, steadier. I didn't need Amanda's approval, nor her acknowledgement of my sacrifices. I didn't need her to admit she was wrong. I had proven, if only to myself, that my worth had never depended on her verdict. I was whole, even in her rejection. Outside, the night stretched quiet over Eugene, the stars faint above the dark pines. I rocked slowly in the chair, the steady rhythm calming, and realized this battle was over. Amanda might continue to fight in courts, might scramble to save what scraps of reputation she had left. But for me, the war had been won. The truth had spoken, louder than any accusation. For the first time in decades, I felt at peace. A month passed, and the weight of the past years began to loosen its grip on me. I had spent long days with Wilson, arranging the insurance money and the small bundle of shares my husband had left into something meaningful. When the paperwork was signed and the account established, the Barlow Community Health Fund was born. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to make a difference, to cover medicine for families who couldn't afford it, to help a neighbor's child see a doctor, to remind people in this town that compassion still existed. When the evening of the fund's small inauguration came, I wanted it to be more than a ceremony. I wanted it to be a table where no one sat in shame. No one was made to wait until last. I borrowed folding tables from the church, laid them across my backyard beneath the old oak trees, and strung wires with glowing bulbs from branch to branch. The light was warm, soft, the kind that made even the most weathered face look young again. Neighbors arrived with covered dishes, friends with casseroles, even families I didn't know well but who had already received help from the fund. Children darted between chairs, laughter chasing them like fireflies. The air smelled of bread, herbs, and fresh earth. For the first time in years, my home didn't feel quiet. It felt alive. At the center of it all sat a roast, steaming and golden, filling the air with a scent both familiar and new. I carved it slowly, deliberately, handing slices to each outstretched plate. When I reached a small boy with freckles who grinned up at me, he took a bite and blurted out with a mouth still full, "This is the best roast ever!" The table erupted in laughter, and the boy's mother flushed with embarrassment before laughing too. The sound rippled through the night, brighter than the string lights above us. I found myself smiling, a real smile. Not the brittle kind I'd worn at Amanda's table. My hands were steady, my heart light. Every plate filled, every glass lifted in gratitude, reminded me that I hadn't lost a family. I had built one. It just didn't share my blood. As I finally sat down among them, my fork in hand, I felt a wave of stillness sweep through me. I was eating with everyone, not after, not in silence, not as a guest shamed at her own daughter's table. I was part of the circle. I thought back to that night in Amanda's dining room, the polished silver, the smirks, the words that slice through me like a blade. You'll eat after everyone else. The cruelty of it had branded me then, but here, under the glow of lights and the hum of voices, it had lost its sting. It had become only the beginning of a story that ended right here, with laughter, with warmth, with a meal shared as equals. I looked across the table at Mildred, who winked at me as she passed a bowl of potatoes, at Samuel, my brother, who raised his glass in a silent toast, at the strangers who weren't strangers anymore, leaning close in conversation. I realized that what Amanda tried to take from me, dignity, belonging, even my home, had instead given me this moment. She had failed to erase me. Instead, she had forced me to remember my own strength. The night deepened, the air cooling, but no one hurried to leave. The roast dwindled to bones, but the table stayed alive with stories and voices, a patchwork of lives woven together. I leaned back, letting the chair creak beneath me, my stomach full, my heart steadier than it had been in years. 2 dinners had marked this season of my life, one that tried to strip me bare, and one that restored me, one that cast me aside, and one that welcomed me in. The first had been a performance of cruelty, the second, a communion of love. And as I took another bite of roast, surrounded by the family I had chosen, I knew the truth at last. I had never needed permission to belong at the table. I had built my own,